Hello, everyone. It's Tim Horn. Welcome back to my podcast, An Author's Advice. This is episode 3. Today, we're going to be talking about the topic of strong stories and conveying a message as the author to your readers. And today, I have my friend Adam Morrill with me, and he's going to ask me some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure to be on here with you and just hear some of your thoughts on these questions. So we'll start with a softball. Why are stories so powerful, in your opinion?
Because as the writer, you have the ability to take your thoughts and put them out there for people to read. And you can do so in a way that is able to entertain the reader, where they can enjoy the story, but they're also learning a lesson from your story. So you can teach them something through the story they're reading, and they're learning from the characters, they're learning from the plot. And as the writer, knowing what you want your readers to learn from your story is one of the most important things that you can put in there.
hmm I think a lot of people, when they think of stories, they think of stories in the form of a book. You know what I mean? Whether it's
Mhm.
a novel or some other form of literature. But what do you think? What kind of value do you think stories have in lectures, persuasive speeches, and other forms of communication?
Well, in general, communication is very important through stories because, like, we can see throughout history, lots of great historical figures gave speeches to inspire people. You know, leaders of the country would always give a speech to inspire their people. So we can see that telling a story is a way to communicate, convey information to the people. And in a lecture setting too, this is important because whether you're in high school or college or whatever grade level you're in, you're always trying to learn. And the goal of the teacher is to teach you what they want you to know, but also to hold your interest. So putting in a story helps because everybody loves to hear a good story, and but also learning from that story is very important.
Yeah, do you think that people connect with stories more than statistics or some other things like that?
um, I think people definitely connect with stories very a lot. I don't know the statistics off the top of
hmm
my head, but I know that a good story is a great way to connect with people, to convey a message, and help get your point across to an audience.
hmm So Jesus is considered the greatest teacher of all times, and there's a lot of examples in the Bible of his teachings and how he went about it. So, how would you say that Jesus incorporated stories into his teachings?
Well, we know that he used parables quite often, and the Bible tells us this was his way of taking his message and putting it in the way that the common man could understand in his day. So many parables we see, he teaches a moral lesson to the people. And he tells his disciples, you know, I teach in parables so they understand, but with you I speak plainly about things. And so it's like he knows that if he tries to tell people about heaven, about all that stuff all at once, it would be too much for them to understand. So putting it in the parable is a way that they can understand his messages. So we can
hmm
see he used the stories as a way to teach his message and get his point to the people so they can understand.
Yeah, off the top of your head, can you think of like one of Jesus's parables and what it was all about?
Let's see. Well, I remember the exact like verse it came from, but I remember that there was the parable about the seeds and the how the farmer sowed the field, and the seeds that fell upon the soil versus the seeds that fell upon the hard stone and the thorns, and the ones that fell on the good soil grew, and they that was the harvest. The ones that fell upon the thorns and the rocks, they didn't prosper. So we can see that was his message there about, the harvest as far as like believers are concerned. The ones that are on the good soil grow. So and the ones that were on the thorns did not.
You think that story sticks in your memory like more than some of the other teachings in the Bible? That
I do like that one. It was just the one that came to mind at the time, but all of his parables were good.
yeah, I was just thinking like there's not a lot of things from the Bible that I could repeat almost word for word or even thought for thought unless it's a story. And there's something about how stories just stick in my memory. Um, yeah, let's move on to another question. Have you ever tried to communicate a serious message through your stories, like as a writer?
Yeah, I'd like to do that all the time. Most of my short stories have some kind of moral lesson that they are teaching while still being something where it's like it's an adventure and it's exciting for people to read and they like it, but there's also that lesson in there. One of my short stories is about a apple farmer who finds a golden apple growing from one of his trees, and he's very excited because that was a very valuable possession. And then he finds out that the tree is actually on his neighbor's property. And so he has to make the decision, do I say anything and keep it, or do I give it back? And so he ends up giving the apple back. And spoiler alert if you haven't read the short story yet, but he ends up giving the apple back, and his neighbor gives him one of the seeds as a reward. So he goes and plants it, and he ends up getting a tree full of golden apples in the end of the story because he did the right thing instead of keeping the one for himself.
Yeah, I
So,
like that.
you can pretty much a lot of different stories convey different messages, and you can be creative with how you want to do that.
Yeah. Where can I find that story?
It would be on Amazon. You can also find it on my website,
Wait, what's it called again?
Farmer Ted's Happily Ever After.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, I have two young kids, and probably one of the best ways to connect with them in this season of life is reading them stories. Um, now, what do you think of the saying, approach trumps content every time?
Well, I think that they both go hand in hand because what you're trying to your content that you're trying to tell people is very important, but how you tell the story is also your approach is also very important because you know you want to put the story in a way where it's like it's still fun for the person to read, especially if you're writing to a younger audience, little kids. You want to make it something exciting and an adventure and a magical world, but you also want them to understand the point you're trying to make so it doesn't go over their head. So
Hmm.
how you make your point is important, just as important as making your point.
Yeah, that's so true. One of the hardest things for me to read is like operation manuals or manuals for putting things together. And like I know the content is good, but trying to wrap my mind around how it's presented is can be really difficult sometimes. What are some or let me go to this question here. What happens if you try to communicate a strong message through a weak story? So another way of putting that is like you have a really good point to get across, but your story doesn't really do a good job of communicating that point in an engaging way that draws people in.
Well, I think if your story, as you said, is not engaging and hard to follow, you're going to have a lot of people who will end up confused, and a lot of people who maybe they're 2 or 3 chapters into your story and they totally have lost the plot and they've lost interest, and they may not even make it to the end of the story where your point is. So, and this goes back to the question you said earlier, the approach and the content. Having your story flow and make sense is important because you, as the writer, may see it one way in your head, but when someone else comes and reads your story on the paper, they may not be able to follow your train of thought. So, being able to make sure they understand as the reader this is where the story's going, and they're able to keep up and follow it well because it's well written and easy to follow. Then they'll be able to get your point, hopefully. And I mean, every reader is going to have a different perspective on a story that we all think differently, but writing a story that generally most people can follow is very important if you want them to get your point and enjoy your story.
Hmm. Yeah, so then what would you think of as some good examples of like a strong story with a strong message?
Well, I remember back in college in short story class, one of the stories I liked that we read that I think had a pretty clear message was called The Necklace. It's about this woman who borrowed a jeweled necklace from her friend to go to a party, and then she ended up losing it. And then instead of facing her friend and telling her what happened, she and her husband had to work for years upon years to pay off the debt to buy a new one. And with it, but they didn't tell the friend that they lost it. They just bought the new one. And then years later, after they finally paid back the debt, they ran into that friend, and she finally had the courage to tell her friend the truth. And her friend told her, well, it really wasn't that expensive to begin with. It was just kind of like a cheaper costume jewelry. And she realizes she wasted all those years trying to buy an expensive one to replace one that wasn't that valuable to begin with. And the message there, of course, is if she had just been honest and offered to pay for it up front with her friend, then, she could have avoided all that trouble.
Hmm. Yeah, that's huge. So what would be your advice to somebody who wants to share a message that's important to them, but they're having trouble just coming up with a story or a creative way to share that message?
Well, I would say that you should definitely try to look at what you have and add some more creative elements. So, for example, like maybe you haven't finished the story yet, but like I said, you have a really good point, but you need to add more content. So, like you know how you want to tell the story, but you don't have all the little details ironed out yet. You need to step back and say, here's how what my message is that I want to get across, but how do I make it entertaining as well?
Hmm.
So, a method I've always tried is try different endings. So, for example, write the story several different ways and see how it would come out in this version of the story. And then if you don't like it, try this version of the story. And eventually you're going to get to a point where it's just you realize, oh, this is the best version that I can come up with that is entertaining, people will like it, but it also gets my message across that I want to write to people.
And then at what point in the writing process do you show like your manuscripts to other people for feedback?
Well, I've actually touched on this on one of my other episodes. One thing I would definitely say is if you're going to show your manuscript to people, you want to wait till you're at the point where you have like most of the story completed. And you don't want to just show it to anybody. You want to show it to somebody you trust, somebody who you know is going to give you feedback that is helpful. It's like if you show it to somebody and they're the kind of person who will just say, I really liked it, it's good, but they didn't give you actually any helpful feedback. You want to show it to the person who's going to tell you what you don't want to hear, but what you need to hear.
Hmm.
The feedback where they're going to say, well, you could be improved in these areas. So, because then you can make the changes you need to make. So, you want to show it to someone who's going to actually help you with the feedback. And while it's important to be encouraging, you also want to have constructive criticism in there to make the story better in the end. And I would definitely say, in regards to that, also avoid giving out public release dates of your story before you're ready.
Hmm.
Because, say, for example, you tell everybody the story is going to be out in a month, and then 2 weeks later you have a major complication and it sets you back, then you have to go and tell everybody, well, it's actually not going to be done in a month, it's going to be much longer. So I would definitely say, in response to that, avoid just sharing too much information before you're ready. And I would also say, take your time and make sure it's done right because you're the one who determines when your story's ready. So if you don't feel the story's ready and you need to take more time to make sure it is ready, that's definitely something you want to do rather than publish it and not have it done right.
Do you think that, or at least for you personally, like every story should have a moral or a strong message?
I think so, yes. At least that's my preferred style. I mean, everybody writes differently, but I think that, if you're just writing a story for the sake of writing a story, you don't want to, you want to have some kind of purpose behind it. You should always be asking myself, what are my readers going to get out of this other than just the purpose of enjoying the story? What are they going to learn?
Yeah,
And
and
it doesn't have to be, oh, sorry, what was it?
I was gonna ask how that played out with is it Detective Davis
Hmm.
in the Swamp Bandits? Like in that in those novels, like what was the kind of message that you were trying to, or values that you were trying to communicate through those books?
Well, with those, I think it's more of the common like it's the good guys versus the bad guys. The detective who is trying to uphold the law and solve the crime and catch the bad guys. And he's doing it with this newfound team and he has to, go into the situation where it's very dangerous. He doesn't know what he's doing. It's just one of his first cases and I think the moral is, he has to trust his team. He has to trust, even though he doesn't know them that well yet. He has to trust that they have his back and they're helping him solve the case. So I'd say the message is teamwork, friendship, and like I said, the idea of the good guy succeeding in the end, catching the bad guys and solving the case, solving the bank robbery. So I'd say that would be the
Awesome.
message there. But yeah, definitely stories are a very good way to help us communicate with others.
Very good. Well, that's all I have for questions.
Okay. Well, thank you again for being on here with me today. And everybody remember, if you have an idea or a topic that you would like to discuss with me, you can definitely reach out and give me that topic. And maybe next time it'll be you here on the air with me. And again, if you'd like to find any of my material, you can check out my website, timstales.net, and you can find any information you need to know about my stuff there. So